Allô, Lucien? Out! Et voilà où est le problème, Simon.
During the First World War, a French fighter ace named Joe goes up against a German counterpart named Gunther. Joe eventually tricks Gunther and starts shooting him from behind, while some German soldiers watch them from the battlefield. Since Gunther appears to be losing the battle, a lieutenant named Rosenblum tells a corporal named Hitler to load his machine gun for him so he can try to shoot down Joe's plane. In the process, Hitler makes a mistake, and Rosenblum insults him and complains about how he has never liked the corporal. He eventually gets pissed and walks away, and Hitler looks disappointed by this. Meanwhile, Joe shoots Gunther's plane repeatedly, and the German fighter ace struggles to keep his plane in the air. Just before he lands, he throws a net on the blade of Joe's plane, and this stops it from working. The two soldiers eventually land their planes, and they appear to be unhurt. As Joe then paints a plus sign on his plane to imply that he won the battle, Gunther seems pissed because he thinks he eventually got the upper hand. After they argue about who won the battle, Gunther pulls out his gun and says that he'll take Joe as his prisoner. Joe is surprised by this, but he eventually knocks the gun out of Gunther's hand. As Gunther tries to fight with his fists, Joe warns him to be careful because he's a boxer. Gunther doesn't seem to care, but Joe ends up punching him a few times. Just before Joe hits him again, he sees a bomb about to land next to them, so he grabs Gunther and jumps into the dirty pool of water so that they won't get hit. Gunther thanks him for this, and they both look happy to have survived the attack. 20 years later, Joe becomes the boxing coach for the French Olympic team. During a qualifying match, Joe encourages one of his boxers, Micholo, to fight well to knock out his opponent. After one of the rounds, Joe tells Micholo to keep following his instructions so he can win the match. As he then tries to pour some water on Micholo to keep him energized, it accidentally splashes on a lady in the audience named Gabby. She seems pissed by this, but Joe says sorry for what he did. As she walks away, some men at the match make fun of her and she looks pissed. After a while, the boxing match continues and Micholo beats his opponent and qualifies for the Olympics. Much later, Joe goes to a nearby restaurant to celebrate the win with his friends and some members of his team. As he then jokes about how Micholo won the match, he accidentally moves his chair back and it hits Gabby, whose face gets slammed against her plate of soup. Joe immediately apologizes for this, but Gabby seems pissed that this is the second time he'll get her dress soiled. Joe says sorry again, but Gabby still seems really pissed. Joe and his friends then make fun of her and laugh about what happened. After this, Gabby suddenly raises her glass and proposes a toast to all foreign sports people who have refused to attend the Olympics in Berlin. She adds that those people are brave because they won't be parading for Hitler and doing the Nazi salute. One of Joe's friends says it's an Olympic salute, but Joe mentions that he and his boxers won't be parading for Hitler. As Joe's friend tells him not to mix sports with politics, Gabby suddenly starts writing something on a piece of paper. Joe then tells his friend that the French Olympic Committee should have refused to participate in the Olympic Games held in a fascist country. Joe's friend says it's not really a big deal because many other countries will be participating in the Olympics. He adds that the Germans even have Jews on their team, but Joe still complains about this. As Gabby finishes writing on the piece of paper, she tears it off and leaves the restaurant. She then calls someone who tells her to go to Berlin because Hitler is ready to let her interview him. Gabby looks quite happy and tells the person that she has already written a perfect story about Joe's opinion on the Berlin Olympics.
Mais bien sûr.
Interestingly, it turns out that Gabby is a journalist, and she had actually started up the conversation about the Olympics just to get Joe's opinion. Days later, the French Olympic team leaves for Berlin by train, and while Joe is talking to some of his boxers, a boy named Simon walks up to him to ask for his autograph. Joe assumes that Simon wants an autograph from one of the boxers, so he tells Micholo to sign Simon's book. Just then, one of the coaches on the team, Lucien, shows Joe a newspaper newspaper article about his comments regarding Hitler and the Olympics. Joe looks surprised by this, but Lucien scolds him because the story could affect how the team is received in Germany. Joe then sees that the story was written by someone named GB, as he asks his boxers if they know the person they say they don't, but Joe mentions that he can't wait to find out who it is.
C'est une question de vie ou de mort.
Almost immediately, he sees Gabby reading the newspaper inside the train. He then sits with her and tells her not to take the story seriously because it's fake. As Gabby puts down the newspaper, Joe asks if she's going to Berlin for the games, but she says she isn't. Joe then tries to find out why she's going there, and he eventually realizes that she's heading to Berlin to see someone. During their conversation, Simon interrupts them and asks Joe for his autograph again. Joe tells Simon to come back later, and he then asks Gabby if she'd like to go on a date with him when they get to Berlin. Gabby doesn't seem interested in this, and she walks away from the table while Joe looks disappointed. Shortly after, while he's with his team, Simon comes over to meet Joe again to sign his book. As Joe decides to sign it, he sees that Simon has some of his old pictures from when he was in the military. Joe admires them, and Simon says he has always been a big fan of Joe's work. Joe then asks if Simon is French, but he says he's German. Just as Joe signs the book, some Gestapo officers on the train start checking everyone's tickets.
Yeah?
Almost immediately, Joe reads something in Simon's book and realizes that he's a Jew. As the Gestapo officers hear this, they look at Simon strangely, and Joe seems worried about this. Shortly after, the train arrives in Berlin, and as the French athletes enter a bus taking them to their hotel, Joe sees Gabby standing alone with her bags. He then ditches the bus and goes to meet Gabby to ask if he can help her get to her hotel safely. Gabby says he doesn't have to worry about her because someone will be picking her up at the station. Joe looks disappointed by this, but Gabby tells him to help Simon instead, because it seems he's all alone at the station. Joe doesn't seem interested in doing this, but Gabby convinces him to change his mind. After her ride arrives, she leaves the station, and Joe asks Simon about his parents. Simon says they're dead,
Tes parents, où ils sont?
but Joe asks if there are other people who have been taking care of him. Simon says that he has been staying with his grandparents and that they can go to his grandfather's bookstore to look for him. Following this, Joe and Simon enter a cab heading to the bookstore. Just as they get there, Joe sees some people inside, but Simon says it's the Nazi police. Joe soon realizes this and tells the cab to stop. He then tells Simon to wait with the bags while he goes to the bookstore. As Joe gets there, he sees that the Gestapo officers are scattering the store because Simon's grandfather is a Jew and he's also selling some books written by Jewish authors. Joe seems pissed by this and he provokes the men to fight him. As they do this, he beats them up and Simon looks happy while watching from outside. Suddenly, his grandparents and other family members show up in the area and get him to quickly join them in a car. Joe sees this and looks confused, but he eventually runs away from the Gestapo officers who keep following him. Before they can catch him, he changes his clothes and grabs the Olympic torch from a runner so that he can get away easily. Just then, the Gestapo officers find his clothes and see his ID card, which shows who he is. Elsewhere, Gabby arrives at her hotel and meets two of Hitler's associates, who tell her that she'll have to meet with Hitler in his private suite. Gabby doesn't feel comfortable about this, and she lies that she has a date with someone. As the men look confused, Joe enters the hotel, and she runs to meet him. She then claims that Joe is her date, and he plays along quite well. After the men leave, Joe and Gabby laugh about this, but before they head to their respective rooms, Simon shows up with Joe's bags. Joe then asks where he went, and he says that he was with his family members. He adds that they're currently outside because they have nowhere to stay. Joe then secretly brings them into the hotel so that he can get his boxers to share their rooms with Simon's family. Interestingly, Simon's grandfather happens to be Rosenblum.
Mais voilà où est le problème, Simon.
and on the way to the room, he tells Joe that he used to be Hitler's superior during the First World War, but that the country is no longer safe for him. After Joe gets Simon and his family members to share rooms with his boxers, he goes to see Gabby in her room. As he enters the room, she gets a call from someone who calls her GB. Joe sounds shocked to hear this, and Gabby quickly ends the call. She then tries to explain herself, but Joe says she wasn't supposed to write the story because he was only talking to his friends. After he says that she's a champion at conning people, he mentions that even though he had planned to beat up the journalist who wrote the story, he'll just leave her alone. The next morning, as the French athletes leave the hotel with Simon's family, who also wear the team's uniform, Gunther arrives, and Joe looks happy to see him. Joe then asks if Gunther brought his car, and he says he did. After Joe collects the key, he holds it behind his back and signals Simon to take it so he can leave with his family.
Joe Cavalier, faites monter ça dans ma chambre.
As they do this, the Gestapo officers from the previous day show up at the hotel to accuse Joe of beating them up. Gunther now happens to be a general in the army, and he tells them not to talk to his friend like that. The Gestapo officers don't seem happy with this, and they complain about what Joe did the previous day. They also seem pissed that they can't do anything to him because of Gunther, but they imply that they won't forget what happened. After they leave, Gunther complains about them, but Joe just hails his friend as a war hero. Gunther also talks about disliking Hitler, and Joe tells him to move to Paris. However, Gunther says he can't leave the country because he's German. Joe then tells him to try to kick Hitler out of office, but Gunther says it's hard. He adds that many people believe Hitler is doing a good job, and that's why they voted for him in the election.
Vous voyez trop de films américains, Monsieur Rosenbloom?
After they leave the hotel, Gunther realizes that his car is missing, and Joe explains that he gave it to Simon's family to help them escape from Germany because they're Jews. Gunther seems pissed by this, but Joe tells him that Simon's family will leave his car at the Austrian border when they get there. He adds that Gunther shouldn't be pissed because they've just helped some good people. Gunther then asks if Joe will attend the parade for Hitler, but he jokes that he can't see himself doing the Nazi salute. The two friends laugh about this, and the French team eventually leaves for the opening ceremony. Shortly after, all the teams parade for Hitler, and he also gives a speech at the ceremony. Days later, while Joe is training his boxers for their upcoming matches, Gunther comes over to see him. The men then leave together, and Gunther eventually shows Joe one of the modern planes they now have in Germany. Joe looks impressed, but Gunther complains that Hitler doesn't really like the new planes. Joe then suggests taking the plane out for a while, but Gabby suddenly approaches them with her car. As Joe wonders what she wants, Gabby tells him that Simon's family has been arrested, and he's currently 200 kilometers north of Munich.
Qui ça, il?
She adds that Simon's grandmother said something that got the family arrested, but Simon was already in the toilet at the time. As she mentions that Simon is waiting for Joe, he sounds pissed and says that he doesn't even know the boy very well. He adds that he's the coach of the French boxing team and not a nanny. He also says that his boxers have two important games the next day, and he won't be going to Munich because he wants to see his team win gold medals. As Gabby wonders what they'll do about Simon, Gunther asks where he is. After Gabby says his exact location, Gunther asks if she has used a parachute before. Gabby says she hasn't, and Joe then volunteers to help Simon because it will give him a chance to fly the modern plane with Gunther.
Alors Joe, tu viens?
Following this, Gunther and Joe leave for Munich with the plane, and after a while they see Simon waiting next to Gunther's car. Joe eventually uses a parachute to land safely, and Simon runs to hug him. Joe then asks how Simon planned to get to Austria, and he mentions that his sister is supposed to pick him up at a hotel in the country. After this, Joe says he'll take Simon to his sister so that he can return quickly to watch his boxers. Elsewhere, some Gestapo officers interrupt the French team's training to ask why some Jews were caught wearing the team's uniforms. Lucien tries to avoid the question, but one of the players then informs him that Joe wants to speak to him on the phone. As Lucien goes to answer the call, the chief Gestapo officer snatches the phone and hears Joe saying that he's 200 kilometers north of Munich and that he's helping Simon cross the border to get to Austria. The Gestapo officer remains silent throughout the call, and Joe suspects suspects that something is wrong. He eventually ends the call, and the Gestapo officer orders his colleagues to start looking for Joe and Simon around Munich.
Le genre aventurier?
After a while, Joe leaves the hotel where he made the call and tells Simon that they need to continue their journey. On the way, he then teaches Simon how to drive, but as he suspects that they're being followed, he takes over the steering wheel and makes a turn onto a road leading to the woods. After a while, they stop to rest, and Joe tells Simon about how he ruined his boxing career. Simon doesn't really seem interested in this, and he asks Joe what the police will do to his family. Joe says they'll likely be interrogated and released after the police realize that they haven't committed any crimes. Simon doesn't believe this, and he mentions that he once had a friend whose family were never seen again after they got arrested by the police. Joe says they probably traveled away from the country, and he tells Simon not to be worried about it. He also prepares a place for them to sleep, but before Simon lies down, he hears a strange sound in the woods. As he complains about it, Joe laughs loudly, and Simon looks confused. Joe then says he did that to scare whoever is in the woods away. After they eventually fall asleep, a baby bear approaches them and eats some of their food.
Hello, Lucien.
The next morning, when Joe wakes up, he sees the bear sleeping next to him, and he quickly wakes Simon up. Almost immediately, a bigger bear starts walking toward them, and Joe quickly packs up his things so that he can leave with Simon. Interestingly, the baby bear follows them, but Joe doesn't complain about this. After a while, Joe sees a roadblock ahead, and he looks worried that the police will arrest Simon. He then tells Simon to hide under the parachute while he tries to get past the police. As the cops stop him, they ask for his ID, and he shows them that the car belongs to his friend. One of the officers then says that they're looking for a young boy, but Joe pretends not to know what he's talking about. As the officer then takes up the parachute, he sees Simon hiding under it, but before he can do anything, Joe destroys the barriers on the road and drives away. The officers immediately chase the car with their bikes, but Joe eventually gets Simon to drive while he tries to take them down. He eventually removes the spare tires from both sides of the car and throws them at two of the officers to knock them down. Joe then takes back the wheel, but two officers still continue chasing the car. Suddenly, the parachute falls out of the car and obstructs the men, and this gives Joe an idea. As he then releases the parachute, it blocks the officers and they crash into a tree. After a while, Joe decides to ditch the bear and the car. Simon doesn't think it's a good idea, but Joe says they can't take the bear any further because it's dangerous. Joe also mentions that the cops have seen the car and it's best to move on without it. Simon still seems worried, but Joe says that the bear is better off with his family.
Allez, assez joué.
Simon doesn't think the bear will meet with his family again because he's far away from home, but Joe believes he'll adapt to the circumstances. Much later, while Gunther and Gabby are together, a soldier comes over to inform the general that the person who stole his car has been arrested with a young boy. Gunther realizes that Joe and Simon have been caught, and Gabby suggests going to help them. Gunther says he'll go alone, and he tells the soldier to inform Hitler that he'll be late for the state meeting that night. Shortly after, Joe and Simon are taken to a police station, and there they see Simon's family. Simon looks happy to see them, and as one of the cops confirms that he's related to them, he tells the family to stay together in a nearby room while Joe is taken to meet their boss. Interestingly, Gunther is already in the office of the chief of police, and he mentions that Joe borrowed his car. The chief of police says he didn't know that, but he sounds concerned because he thinks Joe is dangerous. Gunther says he's not, and he mentions that Joe is his good friend.
Baisse-toi, petit!
As Joe gets to the office, he snatches Gunther's gun and requests to be uncuffed immediately. Gunther looks shocked and says that he was about to get Joe released. Joe doesn't seem to care, and he says that he won't leave Simon's family behind. Gunther doesn't get why he's so interested in helping the family, but Joe insists that he can't leave them. After using the gun to scare the cops in the building, Joe leaves with Simon's family, and Gunther drives them away. Almost Almost immediately, the Gestapo officers arrive at the scene and they ask for Joe and Simon. After hearing that they've escaped, the officers enter their car to chase them. Much later, Joe asks if Gunther can help him get a plane back to Berlin after he drops Simon's family off at the Austrian border. Gunther says that Joe can't go back to Berlin because he'll be arrested for helping the Jews escape.
Monsieur, votre chambre. Vous avez des bagages?
Joe seems pissed by this, but Simon's aunt convinces him to come with them to Austria because it will be safer there. After Gunther drops them off by the road, he tells them where to pass so they can get to the border quickly. Joe then tells Gunther to help him apologize to Gabby for the things he said the other day. Gunther says he'll deliver Joe's message, and after this, Joe leaves with the family. Before they go too far, they see the Gestapo officers still far behind, but Joe tells Simon and his family to move faster. Meanwhile, a farmer accidentally turns the sign pointing toward Austria. When Joe and Simon's family reach the junction, they end up taking the wrong turn, which leads back to a town in Germany. As the Gestapo officers get closer, Joe sees them and turns the sign again. Interestingly, the Gestapo officers fall for this, and they end up going to the Austrian border because they believe that's where Joe is headed.
Allô?
Meanwhile, Joe and the Jewish family reach a fence, which they believe is the Austrian border, and they start trying to find a way to get to the other side. Elsewhere, Gabby interviews Hitler just as planned, but she finds him to be a weird man. Shortly after, Gunther arrives at the residence, and Hitler welcomes him. Gunther also sees Gabby and greets her. Just as rain is about to start falling, Hitler's sister, Angela, comes outside to give her brother his jacket. The rain eventually starts, and everyone enters the house. As Gabby then secretly asks Gunther about Joe and Simon, he says that they're already in Austria, and this makes her happy. Shortly after, Joe and Simon's family get past the fence and see a nearby house. Since they're supposed to wait in a hotel in Austria for someone to pick them up, they assume that they're in the right place, but unfortunately, it turns out to be Hitler's residence.
Aux Jeux Olympiques, naturellement.
Coincidentally, the Gestapo officers have just arrived in Austria, and they see some Austrian musicians who are headed to Germany to sing at Hitler's residence. The chief Gestapo officer then calls Angela to confirm this, but before she says anything, Joe and the others enter the house, so she assumes that they're the musicians. After she ends the call, she welcomes the family to the house, but as Joe asks if she has a radio, she looks confused as to why there's a Frenchman in the band. Joe just ignores the question and asks for a radio, and Angela says that her brother has one in his office. Joe then taps her cheek, and Angela seems impressed by this. She then takes him to her brother's office while Simon and his family are taken elsewhere to get new clothes. On the way to Hitler's office, Angela talks about how her brother's astrologer recently told her that she'd soon meet her soulmate. As she implies that it could be Joe, he just ignores her, and she shows him where the radio is. Joe thanks her for this, and Angela says she'll tell her brother that he has a guest.
General von Beckmann, mein Führer.
Joe then listens to the commentary of Mikolo's match, and he seems quite nervous as he punches the air. Suddenly, Hitler enters the room and looks confused when he sees what Joe is doing. Just as Mikolo is announced as the winner of the gold medal, Joe sees Hitler in the room and looks shocked. Hitler doesn't seem to care about him, and he just heads to his room. Joe then jumps out through the balcony before anyone figures out who he is. Unfortunately, one of the soldiers at the house catches him and asks who he is. Joe doesn't know how to respond, and the soldier decides to take him inside. On the way, Simon trips the soldier, and Joe knocks him out before taking him into a storeroom to remove his uniform. Joe also tells Simon to get one of Gunther's business cards from his car. After a while, Joe enters the house while Hitler is giving a speech at the state meeting. Almost immediately, Gunther sees Joe and looks shocked because he thought his friend was already in Austria.
Les Allemands sont tous avec nous.
Joe then blames Gunther for leading him and Simon's family to the wrong place. After the meeting, Hitler enters the living room to greet Simon's family because he thinks they're the musicians scheduled to perform for him. As Simon's grandmother sees him, she faints, and Hitler looks confused. Someone then mentions that she was likely just too excited to see Hitler. Interestingly, Hitler doesn't recognize Rosenblum, and he just tells the family to start playing the music. After initially looking confused, they eventually start playing the instruments badly. But before Hitler realizes this, he hears a better song from some of his citizens who have come to greet him. Elsewhere, Simon slips Gunther's card under Angela's door, and it turns out that Joe has written on it that Gunther loves her and would love to run away with her. Angela seems happy about this, and she starts packing her things. Meanwhile, Gunther seems pissed that Joe might put him in trouble, but the French coach tells him that he already has a plan. He then says that he plans to use Hitler's car to escape with Simon and his family.
Mais pourquoi musique? Pourquoi?
Gunther doesn't seem to get this, but Joe mentions that his friend has to leave with Angela in his car. Just then, Angela calls Gunther and tells him that she's ready to leave. Gunther then realizes what Joe has done, but he plays along and asks if Angela has a car. Angela says she uses Hitler's Mercedes, but Gunther mentions that he prefers taking his car instead. Following this, Gunther leaves the house with Angela, and Joe looks happy about this. Coincidentally, the real musicians arrive, and Joe manages to sneak Simon and his family out of the house along with Gabi. As they leave with Hitler's Mercedes, Hitler looks confused, but one of his soldiers tells him that Angela is the one leaving the house. Hitler seems pissed and says that his sister can't leave. He then enters a truck with his guards and chases after his Mercedes. Luckily, Joe drives past the gate without being noticed, but Hitler eventually catches up to the car.
Schöne Musik!
He then orders them to stop, but Rosenblum reveals himself and asks if Hitler doesn't recognize him. As Hitler remembers who Rosenblum is, he looks pissed and tells Joe to stop the car. Joe doesn't listen to him, and he eventually knocks Hitler and his guards off the road. The truck then crashes, and Hitler gets pissed as he enters a pool of water with ducks inside. Joe and the others laugh about this, and they soon get to the Austrian border. Instead of waiting to get checked in, Joe breaks the barriers and speeds into Austria. One of the soldiers at the border then alerts his colleagues that Hitler is invading Austria. After a while, Joe stops the car and gets down with Simon to celebrate their freedom. As they hug each other, they see the baby bear from earlier and seem happy to be reunited with it again. Even though Joe goes to Berlin to coach the French boxing team to win several gold medals, he ends up meeting Simon, who happens to be a Jew. Since Jews aren't safe in Nazi Germany, Joe leaves his team in Berlin and travels across the country to help Simon and his family get to Austria. They don't really enjoy a smooth journey, but with help from Gunther and Gabi, they're eventually able to get to Austria safely. Sometimes, doing the right thing involves making sacrifices, even when it's difficult.